I like the Christie's comment about connecting. Whoops, I've got to click something. I can't multitask. You are screen sharing. It's in the way. I need to move that. Oh, well, okay. Anyways, I like Christie's comment about connecting capacities. The breadth of material covered in this summit speaks to that, and so in a way does the topic of this talk, because because it's relating things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be related to one another. That somehow that tidal wetlands and trees in them can provide important clues to earthquake hazards by helping to show how large the earthquakes can get and how often they happen. But that's the case here, and I'll start with just a few slides to try to introduce the main points, and then I'll turn to three different sections that I'll get to in a forthcoming slide here. The title "Bearing Trees" has a direct meaning in terms of some land surveys that we'll get to. Let's see, I'm unable to advance this. How can I do that? Let me see. This is interesting. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. All right, so in the previous slide, there was a tree ring scientist putting a tape measure around the stump of a western red cedar. Here's a Department of Ecology oblique photo of the Bone River down at Wolpa Bay, and you see casting the shadows in the salt marsh there are trunks of western red cedar. And it's a kind of an ecological oxymoron to have western red cedar not tolerant of salt sitting out in a salt marsh. So, you know, how did they get there? And the pitch with this talk is that an earthquake in 1700 is responsible for the deaths of the trees, and that's something that's been worked on for quite a while, and we'll see how that, or get a reminder of how that how tree death dated by these red cedar was important. But there's a story of building the landscape on which those trees could live, and building it in a tideland, somehow elevating the land so that the trees have their feet away from salt water. And the cartoon here is meant to depict a building of the land across many centuries before the year 1700, when the land drops, and then the land has rebuilt, but the restoration, the habitat restoration, has been only partial. In areas where western red cedar is in the previous slide, where you just had a salt marsh, no trees at all, right? And even in the place we're going with trees, we'll see that western red cedar hasn't returned yet. So at the bottom is a cartoon of how this might be related to earthquakes. That the kind of earthquake we're looking at with subduction zones is one that's very good at making coastal land levels change, and in our coast dropping them by 5 feet or so. And then in between the earthquakes, the tides bring in mud. That helps to build the land up. But then also there's a tectonic cycle that bulges the landscape back up before the next earthquake releases the bulge and and the land drops. So we'll take a look at elements of this story with 3 snapshots, and the first will be in Washington Territory of the 1850s. We'll look at some historical ecological evidence there. We'll introduce it in part 1, and we'll return to it in part 3. In part 2, we'll take a side trip up to Alaska. And then in part 3, we'll come back down to Cascadia. So part 1, Washington Territory. Some of you may have seen this naturalist's diaries. They're online with Smithsonian. And by the way, this presentation, Jackson, I think you may have a file for it, and in that file I embedded references. So if people are interested, get the file from maybe it can be posted on the Summit website, and then people can get the supporting references that go with these slides. So there'll be a URL to Cooper's diaries, which are fascinating. Or journals. He was a wide-ranging naturalist, commissioned in some ways out here by the Smithsonian. But his very first step across the drainage divide, taking the portage from the Wolcott River down on the Columbia across to Shoalwater Bay to Willapa Bay in March of 1854. He runs into these. In his journal, he says, "Stumps of cedar stand in meadows of very great age." I assume he means that the cedar look like they're old, not that the meadows look like they're old. And he clarifies this in a report he wrote for a railway survey that brought him out here to begin with, Isaac Stevens' survey. And here's part of what he says. I got a coffee break now. So Cooper was really puzzled by these trees because he saw elevated Pleistocene shells, similar to pretty much the same assemblage living in modern Willapa Bay. So he could see that the land in long term was rising, and yet these trees somehow had sunk. It was very clear to him. And he couldn't he struggled with this in his report and never got to it. And it has to do probably with the cycles of bulging up between earthquakes and dropping down between during earthquakes, and the bulge slightly wins out in the long term. On map at right, there are little red circles showing western red cedar like that have been identified as in modern tidal wetlands standing dead. The ones that Cooper first ran into there are the southwesternmost ones down at Tarlet Slough. But this report is frustrating, this railway survey report of Cooper's. He doesn't tell you where he saw them except in this one-liner in his journal. And he was dealing with people who coursed these streams, native people and the oyster folks working with them. And a good chance he got a lot of his information about the extent of these trees secondhand. But there turns out to be a survey done in 1855 in which trees standing dead red cedar in tidal marsh that they were pinpointed, and they entered the official survey notes. And I think many of you are familiar with the use of these general land office surveys for historical ecology, because the surveyors were required to put monuments at section corners and quarter section corners and stuff, and they used bearing trees to do that, right? And this was all in service of this Domation Lands Claimed Act that Congress passed in 1850 for these so-called public lands in what was then Oregon Territory and included Washington at that point. You see the poor puns, groaning puns of the instructions in 1851 with names, the family names of the people measuring distance with chain and carrying axes and figuring out directions. Here's an example for James Swan. Many of you know of his writings about both up at Neah Bay and down at Shoalwater Bay, where Swan had taken out one of these donation land claims at the mouth of the Bone River, just downstream from those snags we saw. And the donation land claim, I've shaded it, is cited there. And then there, in order for this claim to work, they had to have it surveyed, and they had to have a reference grid for it, hence these rectangular surveys. It's impossible to use this stuff for historical ecology without acknowledging that there's a really bad side to this, and this is picked up in this quote by you'll just read there. So here Gibbs was trained as a lawyer. He came out for the California Gold Rush. He was in the West for a dozen years. He lived he lived for a while in Steilacoom, and he worked as an ethnologist and as a geologist and various things. So he was part of. He and Cooper worked together on Isaac Stevens' railway survey, but he lodged in this protest against the Donation Claims Land Act, which lays the foundation for the survey that we're about to use to encounter earthquake-related trees. So here the Surveyor General now of Washington Territory, the Washington Territory having been established in, what, 1853, something like that, is showing you the status of these rectangular surveys as of 1855, and he's got some dashed lines for ones that he wants to have surveyed, and they include this one just south of Bruceport, including the area of the South Fork Palix River and Bay Center, and so that's the survey we're going to be looking at. The diagram at left is from the field notes that are available online. And here's the outline of that entire 36 square mile township. All right, so in this case, there were no puns in the names of the people who did the work. The General Land Office didn't have surveyors of its own. It contracted out. And the people who did the contract work were called deputy surveyors. So John Lowell was this deputy surveyor. And I put the note there that he does this survey in the autumn of 1855. And he's dead by in early April 56, because he's joined a volunteer militia in the Indian Wars, and he drowns trying to cross the White River. But there's his crew. And a large crew, but you can imagine why. That their job was, what they surveyed, what they observed, was from walking these straight lines through the Devil's Club and everything else, right? And across all these tidal sloughs. And they had to measure all along these lines, and then they had to monument the corners where the green lines intersect, and then also the quarter section corners where the thin black lines intersect the greens that the green I've added here. And in this area, it meant that they had to cross a lot of tidal wetlands. And in the 80s, I was putting dots on air photos and maps of locating some of these dead red cedar. And so I've plotted them, projected them onto Lowell's survey. And you can see down in the south that where I've highlighted it in yellow, that there are a number of these that are very close to a section line, so they could serve as as bearing trees for Lowell's monumenting of corners. All right, so that becomes the search in our field trip. But before we get to that field trip, we have to lay a bit more groundwork, first by going to Alaska. So 64 Alaska was a case where subduction was, it was subduction in action. Before the term subduction zone was in the geological lexicon. Plate tectonics wasn't there either at that point in 1964. The very mechanism of the 1964 earthquake was just a mystery at the outset, but what nailed it, and you can see on this map, today we have these lines we put out there that are called subduction zones. Everybody says, oh yeah, lots of subduction zones in there. And a lot of the world's seismic hazards are arrayed along the edges of subduction zones, including ours. Okay, but the basic idea that came out of 64 Alaska was that you had a slab of the ocean, under the ocean floor, that's diving underneath the edge of the continent. And that that between earthquakes, because the fault at the plate boundary is locked, is stuck, the overriding, and the plates are moving towards one another, the overriding plate gets shortened, so it thickens. And then during an earthquake, when things get unlocked, then the bulge that had formed during the earthquake, between earthquakes, collapses. And of course, the vertical displacement of the ocean floor also drives a tsunami. Well, that pattern of uplift and subsidence was mapped with more than 1,000 observation points by an intrepid group of geologists working on shorelines, and then there were surveyors re-leveling geodetic benchmarks. Those are the inland lines. Also, there was work done with tide gauge stations and tidal reference marks. And so all of these painted a picture of downdrop in blue and uplift in red. And we'll go southeast of Anchorage to the Portage area to see some of the geological effects of that. So it took until the earthquake was in late March. The first set of very high post-earthquake tides that broke through some of the ice in this part of Cook Inlet occurred in April. And they brought in ice that littered the highway you can see here. I think the photographer's car is visible in the distance. It might be one of the unsafe at any speed models, the Corvairs, I think. A couple of things you can see about one thing you see about this landscape, of course, is that it's tall, and there are glaciers all over the place, and streams pouring in sediment. And furthermore, this part of Cook Inlet, well, at least at Anchorage, the tide range is 10 meters. So the tides roar into this end of Cook Inlet with the extreme ones. They come looking like tsunamis, and they can carry a lot of sediment, and that'll play out here in the ecological restoration story, because this, in some ways, the Alaska earthquake is a story of a natural ecological restoration. So those first post-earthquake tides flooded the settlement of Portage. And here you can see the ice cubes out there, and I've labeled some gas pumps that'll show up in subsequent slides. But there's a highway, the Seward Highway and the Alaska Railroad are mostly submerged in this photo. Down at the bottom, what can you see? And at the top, you can see that there are trees getting submerged, right? And this water was salty, and the trees were done on these. These are Sitka spruce. Okay, here's summer of 64, and there are the gas pumps. And you can kind of see where the highway is, and you certainly can see the railroad. This tide isn't as high as the other one. Some of the buildings are being dismantled, carried away, but others are being abandoned. But it looks like the ground looks like a picture of after a snowfall. And it's as if a snowplow has come through and plowed the side road, and tire tracks in front of the gas station make it look like they're spinning their wheels on snow. But this is silt and sand that the tides of those bore tides of Turnagain Arm were bringing in. And and those in stream bank exposures, you can infer a history that a timeline at right, where the first post-earthquake tides are in April, and by August of 64 in the stream bank, it's likely that there had been something like 3/4 of a meter of buildup. And not every high tide gets here. The tide range is so extreme that only the very biggest of them get there. But there are spring neap cycles built into this picture. Couple of things. Let's see. I guess the basic one is that the individual layers, and this gets back to a point made yesterday about how at Gray's Harbor with sediment, you might get a centimeter per year on a tide flat. Well, this is more like a centimeter per high tide for the really big high tides. Those are individual high tides are recorded by those layers. And the geologist can also tell you which way the water was flowing. You see that there are things that look like ripples, and current ripples recorded in sediment tend to migrate upstream. And you can see that the ripples climb in an upstream direction. So these are flood tides coming in charged with sediment that rebuilt this landscape, this natural restoration. And down at the bottom, you can see the 1964 soil. There were moose nuggets littered on that soil. Okay, the gas station itself, there are the gas pumps at right. And I've labeled in numbers a couple of spruce trees, and then there are 2 telephone poles labeled in brown. And so this picture is probably from the summer or early autumn of 64. And I know from a different angle picture that there was a brackish tidal marsh there in front of the garage in 73. I got to go there first in 91 and then again in 98. Here's a 1998 picture, and you can see the part of the gas station has fallen down, and some of the tree trunks aren't as tall as they used to be. They're dead, but now shrubs are moving into the landscape with this thicket of willows, and a picture from early this month from an Alaskan friend shows that essentially that same point of view today. And you can see the habitat restoration that's taken place with new Sitka spruce with the asterisks and lots of shrubs and cottonwoods in their autumn foliage. Okay, so to try to pull that together in a cartoon of the style that we looked at before for our place, you'd start with the downdrop in 1964, which was it's about 2 meters in all. On the right are the amounts of land level change in meters. And in yellow, the 1.5 is for the tectonic part. But then there was shaking induced settlement that accounted for another maybe ½ meter. So in round numbers, it was a 2 meter downdrop. And very early on, certainly there was an extensive survey done in 73 that showed that by then the average thickness of post-earthquake deposits in the Portage area was 1.5 meters. but then so that's the natural part of it. But then there's a kind of frightening human side to this, that there's been uplift of the landscape, ignoring the sediment for a second. There's been uplift of the landscape that between 1964 and the year 2000, the last time it was measured, that uplift was very close to 1 meter. That's a lot of upward bulging, and the geophysicists who've looked at it have concluded that most of that uplift is from the loss of ice mass, from deglaciation of Alaska from climate warming. And so that's something that you don't necessarily get with some of the earlier earthquakes up there, is that component to the restoration story. But uplift helped to raise the land to the point where those cottonwoods and spruce were colonizing places that had been saltwater marshes and tide flats in the first decade after '64. Okay, so that's a modern analog that's really helpful in it's parts of this don't apply to Cascadia, but the basic picture does, and it's been used since the late '80s to interpret the geology down here. So we go back to that earlier cartoon, and you see the time scale now we're talking about is very different, where in the Alaska case, you rebuilt the landscape in a geological instant of inside of a decade, essentially. And for us, it's a little bit slower, and there's the puzzle of how the red cedar got out there. I don't have an answer for that. But the puzzle that was addressed back in the '80s was this one, of course, as to whether we have a big earthquake problem here at all. And the the challenge there was that there had been none since Lewis and Clark, and yet as understanding of plate tectonics helped out by the '64 Alaska earthquake, as that understanding increased, the question was being raised well, it was established that we do have a subduction zone. Mount St. Helens in a way helped with that. But then the question was whether the fault that extends underneath the the Pacific coast of Washington, whether that fault is stuck or whether it's somehow greased. And that was an open question until pretty much until geology in tidal wetlands established that in fact these very big earthquakes have occurred, most recently in 1700. Well, the partial restoration you can see right away here. So this is also at Willapa Vale on the Neowacum, just upstream from the old bridge across the Neowacum, and there are spruce stumps that, and of course the trees don't extend up. The trunks have long rotted away. But those are victims of the 1700 earthquake, and the brackish marsh has no spruce or crabapple in it at all. The restoration, the landscape that was there in 1700 has not been fully reestablished. And then the story with red cedar, and with this one's from South Fork Palix, the Lowell's near Lowell's trees. So we're getting to our field trip here. David Yamaguchi was the tree ring scientist who worked out the story with Western red cedar. He's standing in amidst them here, and there are a few scrawny spruce out on this part of the wetland, but no living red cedar, and basically how David's findings helped was that Japanese researchers told us they thought that they had our tsunami in written records, it said that a tsunami of remote origin had caused flooding and damage in Japan in January 1700. So David was able to ask his western red cedar whether they died in 1700. And you're familiar with the story, I'm sure, that that it was possible for David to use the pattern of thin and thick rings as a barcode, and to take trees that Doug mentioned out of Long Island that had been cut by Weyerhaeuser in 86 and 87, and use the stumps of those trees as reference trees. And he built from them and some older ones a master barcode going back to the year 990. And then he he tried to match the ring width patterns of killed trees, and he was able to get strong statistical matches at 4 places, up at Copalis and Grace Harbor, at Johns River, and at South Fork Palix, and then finally down at Seal Slough on the Columbia. So that was, and then finally one had to go into the roots of the trees in order to nail the time of tree death, because the weather-beaten trunks are eroded, right? So the final ring turned out to be a complete 1699 ring, and 7 of the 8 trees that David was able to run this on. So now we'll see if we can do our little field trip. I'll introduce the characters here shortly. This is from some of the abundant footage that Jackson shot, and I used some of that footage, Jackson, you probably noticed, as for still images, as well as for that video. Whoops. Okay, so one of the things that Jackson filmed was a wonderful talk by Kathleen Sayce about the 3 kinds of trees that are behind her here. There's a sort of a bonsai-looking spruce on the right. There's a red cedar snag that's been logged more nearly towards the middle, and then off to your left is a spruce that's just loaded with cones. And Kathleen told us about the cone part in particular, but the sound, Jackson, I couldn't get it to work, so I don't have that to share with you, but it's a wonderful story. Jessie Pearl is a young tree ring scientist looking into earthquake applications of tree ring science in this region. And then there's Jackson leading the way in a canoe. And off to the right is a stake that probably does serve as something of a guide as to where the witness post was that Lowell put in the bank here in 1855. But I don't have, as you'll see, because this navigator here kind of messed up and looked the wrong direction, essentially. And so we didn't succeed in finding the witness post, but it's probably there. I'll show you the evidence.